Welcome to the 90th episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. Today I will talk about an interesting interview that the Secretary General of Hezbollah gave on the performance of the Liberation Organization in the struggle against Israel. Everybody who has been following since October 7 the fight is sometimes maybe disheartened to see the severe blows that Hamas, Iran, Lebanon got, the fall of Syria, and then you might wonder, are the Israelis winning? It's important to understand the difference between tactic and strategy. A tactical defeat or victory is a defeat or victory that doesn't determine the overall strategy, and a strategic defeat or victory is a defeat or victory that determines the final outcome of a struggle. Pearl Harbor, for example, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical victory for the Japanese, but a strategic defeat for them, because in the long run it didn't matter. In fact, it brought the United States into the war, and that would determine the fate of Japan. And remember, one of the saying of Mao Zedong is the road to victory is strewn with defeats. So if we assess the struggle in Palestine, we will see defeats. And the question will be, is this tactical or strategical? Now, to assess that, let's take some historical examples. Fidel Castro assembled a team of 82 fighters in Mexico, trained them in Mexico. They were from Cuba, among them the Argentinian Che Guevara. And their plan was to arrive in Cuba by boat on a day when an uprising would be held in the cities. But the boat arrived 2 days later than the planned uprising, and of the 82 crew members, 76 were killed at the end. That was a tactical defeat, yet they survived and won, and that was a strategical victory. The fact that they were able to survive, that was a victory. Another example is the Battle of Algiers, when the National Liberation Front of Algeria started building a resistance group in the city of Algiers. The group was killed, but Algeria became free in 1962. There's a tremendously great movie what made of it. I put the link here. You could see it on YouTube, the Battle of Algiers, which shows you the tenacious fight that the Algerians fought of this particular group. They lost, yes, but their fight instilled in their people the will to victory. Now, Hezbollah Secretary General Shahid Naim Qassem reveals war details in an interview with Al Mayadeen for the first time. And he explains how Hezbollah is functioning. It has a Shura Council that is convened regularly, and they decided unanimously to enter the support battle of Gaza. They call it the support battle. They emphasize that this decision wasn't taken lightly. He says this kind of decisions can't be made via phone calls or casual communications. It required an urgent in-person meeting. Hezbollah chose a limited support operation rather than an all-out war because a full-scale war demands significant prior preparations. He says the outcome of a full war is predictable. It requires preparedness that simply wasn't available. So he said if you go into a war, you go into the war to win. If you are not prepared for that, you shouldn't go to a full war. And it says, weekly into the operation, the Shura Council solidified its decision to pursue a support war rather than a comprehensive one. It says their support had three aims: diverting the Israeli occupation forces, meaning drawing a significant number of Israeli forces to northern occupied Palestine; creating social pressure, meaning that they sought, by bombarding the Israeli settlements, they forced the evacuations of the settlers, thereby triggering a social, economic, and security crisis, which basically happened. And it says, just inflicting casualties. The more soldiers we kill, the more we push Israel closer to defeat. He says there was no prior coordination with Hamas before the October 7 operation. We simply didn't know, he says. Based on his information, Iran was not informed in advance of Hamas' plan. He says, in fact, even parts of Hamas leadership abroad weren't aware. Afterward, discussions were held in Beirut with senior Hamas official Khalil al-Hayya and his delegation during their visit. He says both Hezbollah and Palestinian factions, including in a meeting with the late Said Hassan Nasrallah, reached a shared conclusion. The support operation was sufficient to serve the resistance broader aim. So they coordinated after October 7. And then he said, for 2 months we assessed whether this level of support was enough, but we came to see that the Israeli aggression was extreme, supported by new rules of engagement and US backing. Doing more than support would have not changed the outcome, he says. So a full-scale war might lead to a defeat, and they didn't do that. They didn't choose for a full-scale war. And then he goes into the security breaches. He says a central investigative committee has been formed and was still working, alongside several subcommittees examining specific aspects of the breach, including the booby trap pages, the location of Said Nasrallah assassination, and the assassination of Said Hashim Safieddine, the one who followed as a leader of Hezbollah after the martyrdom of Nasrallah. And then he says investigations uncovered a serious vulnerability in the procurement process over a year and a half leading up to the purchase. We didn't know the supply chain had been exposed. With the means available to us, we couldn't detect the presence of explosives. The type of explosive device used inside the pager was highly advanced and undetectable by standard methods. This could be seen as a failure or as a limitation of our capabilities. In the days just before the pager explosion, Hezbollah's teams had already begun to suspect a malfunction. There were efforts to examine the pager differently, including attempts to break it open, which were prompted by some anomalies that raised questions. So they were saying they didn't know that Israel had compromised the whole procurement system of the pages. And he says, we acknowledge a serious gap in our awareness of the scale of Israeli surveillance, particularly through electronic and aerial means. Hezbollah had received reports indicating possible wiretapping, but we didn't realize the extent, that it was near total and very extensive. Israel has been collecting data through areas of surveillance over a 70-year period, documenting geographical and infrastructural changes. We didn't have the capacity to grasp how deep Israel information gathering had gone. To date, he said, human espionage plays a secondary role. There is no evidence of human espionage within Hezbollah's ranks, especially not among senior leadership, and he promised transparency once the internal investigations concludes. The human breach appears very limited compared to the immense volume of data collected through surveillance and drones. There is no indication of any significant breach involving core figures or senior commanders. If we find There has been human penetration. I will speak publicly and disclose the level of that breach. So he says, we will be open because if we're going to lie, we're going to hurt ourselves. But he says, as for now, the human espionage was not that big. And then he said, despite the severe blows, Hezbollah is not defeated because Hezbollah is part of the people. A people like this, a ummah like this, a party and a resistance like this cannot be defeated. Do you expect anything less than for us to remain present, strong, and capable of shaping the future we chose? And referring to the text, he said that they targeted Hezbollah's advanced capabilities, including the bug pages and communication system, as well as the assassination of Nasrallah and Safieddine and a group of top commanders and lower-ranking officers. He says, in the mindset of the Israelis, they expected Hezbollah to collapse. And he says, and yet, here we are back on our feet, engaged in fierce battle and forcing Israel to agree to a ceasefire. What does that say? He praised the Lebanese state leaders for a unified position. He said, I salute President Aoun, Speaker Nabi Berri, and all officials involved in what has become a remarkable display of national unity. There's this constant pressure on the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah, but there are attempts, but in fact they respect Hezbollah military capabilities. And commenting on the Israeli occupation and the recent attacks on the Beirut southern suburb, he says that Hezbollah patience is not unlimited. Resistance will not wait forever. While he didn't disclose time and method, he underscored that when the decision is made, there's no third option between victory and martyrdom. We don't have surrender as an option. So he's basically saying, look, we had a tactical defeat with all these killings and all the horrible things happening, but we are in for a strategic victory and we are preparing for that. The fact that they survived, like Fidel Castro, that fact tells you that there's no strategical defeat because they are rebuilding their capabilities. He talks about Hassan Nasrallah. He says, his martyrdom was not only unexpected to the world, it was unexpected for us. If you had asked me before, I would have said all of us might fall before Nasrallah does. That's how strong, courageous, and divinely guided he was. Martyrdom doesn't end the journey, but rather fuels it. We consider martyrdom the greatest honor, and he received the greatest honor. And the greatest challenge now is carrying on in the absence of a leader whose strength, tone, energy, and stance were irreplaceable. We don't cry because he's gone, we cry because we don't know how to compensate for what we've lost. And after the assassination of Safieddine, Qassem formally assumed the role of Secretary General with direct responsibilities for overseeing Hezbollah's military operation. He said that shortly after he took the lead, he was asked by an Iranian military leader and Lebanese commander outside Hezbollah how he would manage a military campaign. And he laid out 3 key qualifications: the ability to organize and lead effectively, a deep understanding of Hezbollah's missions and strategic visions, and familiarity with the party's structure, resources, and internal workings. And all of these were present here for him. He had served as a deputy for 32 years and was an active member of the Shura Council throughout. All major decisions, from naming unit leaders to launching operations, are made collectively within the Shura Council. There's no appointment without deep discussion. Proposed battle scenarios such as Hezbollah entry into Syria or decisions to retaliate against Israel actions are always brought before the Council. You might say this is our proposal. The Jihadi Council recommends this course. Should we strike this way, launch a drone, fire a rocket? All this goes through internal deliberation. And that is the strength of Hezbollah. And that is what the Americans and the scientists don't understand. That if one of them is taken out, the others come and fill in the position. And he detailed how operational decisions were made for each escalation. When Tel Aviv was struck, that had its own directive. When the strike hit Netanyahu's residence, that required a specific order. Even what the enemy calls Black Sunday on November 24th, 370 rockets and drones in one day, that too was based on a formal decision. So every decision is a directive. It's not just, a loose thing. It is argued, it is taken collectively. He says the military command structure was fully intact at the time of the strike. Every position in the military command was occupied, no seat was left vacant. Contingency plans were implemented quickly after leadership losses. So they anticipated that this might happen, and they had plans for it. They had contingency plans, what to do if Nasrallah is martyred, what to do if these commanders are killed. Now, he says that the Israeli plan, they anticipated the party's total collapse following an unprecedented aerial assault that includes 1,600 strikes in a single day, pager and walkie-talkie terror operations, and the martyrdom of Nasrallah and Safieddine. Under Israeli military doctrine, this should have marked the end of the party. Instead, Hezbollah launched Operation People of Might, and by November 27th, forced Israel to a ceasefire. Now, he described the front as having exhibited legendary resilience. And he says there are two main components responsible. First, the young fighters who were stationed there, they knew what they were doing and held their ground, even if they were cut off from communication. They achieved something heroic. And when asked if Hezbollah still possesses the human and non-human capabilities needed to continue fighting, Qassem declined to disclose number or percentages related to losses or remaining strengths, but he offered a concise yet firm assurance Hezbollah is rebuilding, recovering, and ready now. If Israel were to attack, we will not stand by and watch, we would fight. And regarding claims that 500 of Hezbollah's weapon storage sites south of Litani River has been destroyed, Qassem replied, they are referring to what they saw south of the Litani, but the country is vast. In a candid assessment of the regional landscape, he described the collapse of the Syrian government as a definite loss for the axis of resistance, because Syria served as a vital logistical and political artery for armed Palestinian groups. And despite Hezbollah's historic alliance with Syria, he said that the organization has no connection to the internal situation in Syria following the regime's collapse. And he hoped that the Syrians would ultimately form a unified and independent government that stands against Israel's occupation. And he says we have the right to be cautious. We've received reports from both Western and Arab countries suggesting that there is an idea to use Syria as a tool against Hezbollah. And the new Syrian regime to serve as a destabilizing role in Lebanon. Now, basically this interview tells you that that Hezbollah suffered tactical defeats, but not a strategic defeat. And we see a similar thing with Hamas. One of the Israeli news media outlet says Hamas has successfully appointed new field commanders and is maintaining a functional chain of command directing guerrilla operations against Gaza City and central capital camps to key battle zones. Hamas has not been defeated. 38 Israeli soldiers have been killed since March, suggesting that Hamas fighting capabilities remain largely intact. Hamas now numbers 40,000 resistance fighters, similar to its strength before the Israeli aggression began. That is what an Israeli outlet is saying. And you similar thing you see in Iran. Parliament Speaker Mohammed Bakir Khalibaf said, at 3 a.m. the attack began by targeting the Chief of General Staff. They targeted our planning and command brains and practically blindsided us with missile and drone attacks on radar centers. This part of the operation was planned and carried out with access to satellite information. And then he continues, in such circumstances, the supreme leader, as commander-in-chief of the forces, made a smart decision in the early hours of the shock of the war by issuing the necessary decrees and appointing new commanders, quickly bringing the armed forces out of shock. So he acknowledged that, for a moment, the army was in shock and paralyzed, and that it was the supreme leader who, for no second at all, was paralyzed. He immediately stepped in, and he appointed new people, put energy in it, and within 8 hours they were restored and started to attack Israel, which was a historic attack and change, as I explained in other videos and articles, is changing world history. Now, if we go to our conclusion now, looking at the defeats that the axis of resistance have suffered, we now have a tool to understand these defeats. These are tactical defeats. It's not a strategic defeat. And the fact that they are reconstituting themselves is in itself already part of a strategic victory. Thank you for your attention, and hope to see you next time.